welcome to the Fordham Institute and the Hooper Institution. For people just now walking in, get food and drink at the back, have a seat, and we are commenced. I'm Checker Fenn. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the third in our series of Education 2020, which is intended to look with clear eyes, as in 2020 vision, to the future, as in 2020, of education, and to get some fresh thinking on some long-lasting problems, including two that we will be exploring in considerable depth today with the help of Naomi Schaefer Riley and Jonah Goldberg. And it is my pleasure to kick us off for the first half of this doubleheader. My Fordham friends who follow baseball say that is a sports metaphor. This is a doubleheader which will consist of Naomi and with me, and then Jonah with Mike Petrilli. I have known Naomi, I think, since she was very young, but Naomi, as an adult, has become an extremely prolific writer, author, commentator, columnist, and is now at the American Enterprise Institute. And she is tackling a particularly challenging question, which is the question of the most challenged kids in America. Kids basically without functional parents, and what is the education solution for them, if there is one, and to what extent does school choice supply that solution? And without further ado, it's really an honor and as well as a pleasure to introduce Naomi. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. No, we're going to switch that. Not Checker. And not Jonah, so don't expect any jokes. Thank you all for coming out today. It's really a pleasure to be here. So I want to start by telling you a story. A few years ago, my husband and I had a meeting with our son's first grade teacher. And I, being the doting mother, of course, thought he was behaving like an angel in class. But my husband actually asked the teacher about his behavior. And the teacher told us that he had a habit of, quote, filibustering during class. That might not surprise you if you know my husband and me, but anyway, she said she had asked him several times to cut it out, and it had not worked. So my husband looked at her and said, "We'll take care of it." Upon returning home, we told our son that we were going to take away his Legos until he started listening to his teacher. And when we checked in with her, a week later, magically, the problem had been solved. So I've been thinking about this story recently because I spend most of my time now researching the lives of kids who don't have a parent or any really functioning adult in their house who are paying enough attention to take away their Legos. I want to start by telling you a little bit about a school called Mott Academy, which is a charter school in the Bronx. It's been around for about 10 years now. And a third of the kids there are from families who are receiving preventive services. A third of the kids are in foster homes, and another third are neighborhood kids. The fact that they're receiving preventive services means that they are probably at risk of being removed from their parents at some point soon. The principal tells me that in the event a child comes from the type of family where parent support isn't going to set them up for school success, she says, quote, "We have workarounds for that." The biggest successes of the education reform movement over the last few decades have been rooted in the important idea that we need to give more power to parents to choose their children's educational paths, to escape the monopoly of underperforming neighborhood public schools, and move their sons or daughters either to public charter schools or private schools with the use of vouchers or scholarship funds. But for the hundreds of thousands of children whose parents can't or won't be partners, it's time, I think, for conservatives to start thinking about those, quote, workarounds. Conservatives need to face the fact that choice, at least with these kids, has its limits. This is not to detract at all from everything that education reform has accomplished. In return for providing astonishing academic results, not to mention some of the strongest community support, inner-city Catholic schools, and high-performing charter networks asked only that parents and caregivers act as allies. These adults, often single mothers, aunts, or grandmothers, did not need to be wealthy or educated, only aware and committed. They didn't have to help their kids with homework, only ensure that children would put in a good faith effort. They didn't need to promise that their children would always behave well, just that if their children didn't act appropriately, they would support the school's decisions about the consequences. The results of this bargain have in many cases exceeded the expectations of reformers, especially the high-performing charter networks like Success, KIPP, and Democracy Prep. Students have surpassed their peers in wealthy suburbs, they have gone on to elite colleges, and even their completion rates have surprised critics. What has become clear is that kids from poor families with single parents living in chaotic and crime-ridden neighborhoods can do good and even superlative academic work. As David Whitman writes in his book, Sweating the Small Stuff, most of these paternalistic schools are founded on the premise that minority parents want to do the right thing, but often don't have the time or the resources to keep their children from being dragged down by an unhealthy street culture. And so the teachers and administrators at these schools manage their expectations. As Whitman explains, parents' chief role at No Excuses schools is helping steer their children through the door. Paternalistic schools are typically schools of choice, and then ensuring that their children get to school on time or do their homework. But when schools do not have partners, at least one adult in the home willing to be responsible for getting them to school on time, for ensuring that they get a good night's sleep, and do a little homework, it is hard for No Excuses schools to work. Not only would the kids from these schools be unlikely to succeed without a stable adult at home, they would be unlikely to even apply for a scholarship, a voucher, or a lottery spot. It is not uncommon to hear those who oppose the reforms of the past quarter century criticize the No Excuses model, citing exactly this reason. But the fact that a school model can serve most of the population, if not all of it, is not a reason to throw it out. Let me be clear. Choice is worth pursuing on a nationwide basis and with great intensity because it helps many students. I would even suggest it helps the majority of students. But we need another set of policies and practices for the worst off. There are about 437,000 kids who are in foster care right now in this country, a number that has been rising, as many of you probably know, because of the opioid crisis, or at least it's correlated with that. While there are hundreds of thousands of other kids who are also at risk, that is, receiving preventive services, it's worth focusing on this unique population, I think, because it is large and we know a lot about it. For these kids, the future looks bleak. According to Child Trends, children in foster care are more likely than other children to exhibit high levels of behavioral and emotional problems. They are more likely to be suspended or expelled, and to exhibit low levels of school engagement and involvement with extracurricular activities. Children in foster care are more likely to have received mental health services in the past year, to have a limiting physical, learning, or mental health condition, and to be in poor or fair health. We should be quick to note, of course, that all of these problems are not the result necessarily of being in foster care. Rather, they are more likely the result of the circumstances that put them in foster care to begin with. Children who are in care are not the only kids in dysfunctional home situations. There are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of others who are receiving those services because they're at risk of being removed. I don't want to suggest that kids in these circumstances are not eligible to attend charter schools or Catholic schools. Many of them do and are better off for the interaction with qualified, caring teachers for longer hours each day and more days in the year. Leaders I've spoken to at charter schools are in regular contact with the Administration for Children's Services, Department of Family and Children's Services, depending on what state you live in. They are reporting trauma when they see it, when they see even the slightest evidence of it, and they are trying to do everything they can to keep kids who are removed from their homes actually able to stay in the same school, even if they are living further away, for instance. But some of these schools are simply not equipped to handle the kinds of trauma or mitigate the kind of instability that these kids are experiencing at home. Haven Academy, for its part, offers kids some of the same lessons they would get at other charter school, but they also spend considerable amounts of time helping kids to learn empathy. Haven is run by the New York Foundling, the oldest foster care agency in the city, which helps it offer a kind of unique perspective on this situation. And the Foundling also acts as a referral agency, suggesting to families with children at risk that they could send their children there. At the beginning of each year at Haven, teachers make visits to students' home in order to better understand the environment they are coming from. Like many New York schools, Haven also has a pre-K program. Conservatives have rightly noted that the evidence for most pre-K programs is shaky at best. A recent study in Tennessee found that students who attended the program were actually doing slightly worse academically than those who didn't by grade 4. Researchers looking at this study actually speculated that there is some benefit to kids being at home longer rather than in school earlier. But there are important reasons to get the population we are talking about, foster kids and kids who are at severe risk, into school earlier rather than later. Teachers can keep a better eye on their development and report any instances of abuse or neglect immediately. Mandatory home visiting programs along the lines of nurse-family partnerships, but for older kids, might also help accomplish the goal of allowing teachers and social workers to stay more vigilant. When students enter the building at Haven, there are certain physical differences that you'll notice right away. Classrooms are small, but they also have kind of cozy corners where students who are having difficulty can go to calm down or be alone for a few minutes. At any time of day, there are also extra empty rooms, very small ones, where children who are having larger problems can go with an adult to figure out how to control their behavior. The school has very specific safety plans for when a student is out of control, including getting other children out of the way. But all of this is a last resort. The school tries many other things to prevent these incidents from happening. Kindergartners receive teddy bears at the beginning of the year that they can learn to dress and care for. They also use the RULER program, an acronym for the 5 skills that stands for the 5 skills of emotional intelligence. When they enter a classroom, students are asked to actually rate their own emotional state, both their level of energy and pleasantness on a graph, and they're taught how to be conscious of and shift them to a state that will be more appropriate for learning. The school's efforts to maintain a calm atmosphere extend beyond encouraging self-regulation, though. Instead of a buzzer between classes, 2 minutes of Bach are played through the school speakers. I have to say, I wish every school would do this. It was so lovely. The school also has its own counseling staff and is regularly in touch with both biological and foster parents, as well as a child's caseworker. The bureaucracy of child welfare agencies often makes it very difficult for schools to even find out what is really going on at home. Schools may make reports of maltreatment, but they won't find out what happened or whether anyone followed up. But these schools do find workarounds. This is also true in the area of school discipline. The debate over school suspension has a special impact on this population of kids. What happens when sending a child home is likely to result in no supervision for those days, or worse? More important, perhaps many of the kids at Haven have no idea what it means to even have logical consequences for their actions, and there is little expectation that adults in their lives can be trusted at all. As Haven's principal tells me, it's not about, well, we're going to call your parent and you'll be disciplined at home. If it happened at school, it has to be consequenced at school. If you misbehave at recess, you lose recess. If you misbehave on a field trip, you won't go on the next field trip. If you destroy property, you'll have to work to repair it. Particularly for children at young ages, she says, we want to help kids start becoming more informed agents. When they break a rule, they know what's going to happen to them. This is often very different from what is going on in their home environment. Critics on the left and right will often say that schools cannot make up for all of the deficits that lower income children experience in their homes, that schools cannot become their de facto families. Many schools, most often parochial schools, I think rightly push back against this. For the kids in foster care, whether they are living in group homes with relatives or non-relatives, or for only a few weeks with those people before moving on to the next place, some schools are trying to recreate what a stable family life would look like. At Haven, lunch is served family style with a teacher at each table participating in conversations and encouraging each other to pass the potatoes. Monument Academy, and its leader is here in our room with us. I encourage you to come find her afterwards because it's an amazing place, is a charter school with a 5-day boarding program where several kids live with house parents at the school, eat their meals together, help with chores, and learn to get along in a family setting. In Florida, child welfare officials often refer kids to Seed Miami to ensure that kids in foster care or who are receiving preventive services can get first priority there for admission slots. Monument has also partnered, I think, with Georgetown University to provide some medical and dental care to children at school. Again, it would be very easy for your typical school to tell a parent that their child seems distracted in school because of a toothache or because their breathing seems labored when they are running around the playground. But if there is no one at home to follow up, some schools may simply have to take on these responsibilities for themselves. Leaders of no excuses schools have found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to defend the concept of paternalism, a word they do not like to use. But at least these school leaders could always fall back on the idea that they are simply doing for these kids what their parents want but cannot accomplish. David Whitman contrasts modern no-excuses schools with, say, the Indian boarding schools of the 19th century, which were involuntary, though frankly many Indian parents actually did want their kids to go to these schools. But for the hundreds of thousands of kids with no stable adult presence in their lives, we are going to need involuntary solutions, or we are going to have to exercise even more paternalism in pushing these kids into environments and ensuring that teachers and administrators take on the role of family as much as possible. As conservatives, our first impulse is to remove responsibility for such matters from schools. As James Q. Wilson wrote, paternalism seems to have democracy as its enemy and bureaucracy as its friend. Indeed, too often school administrators have abused these powers to contradict parents' teachings about family matters in the name of sex education, for instance, or to belittle families' religious beliefs. For children without a consistent adult presence in the home or who have experienced severe trauma in their home, school may be as close as they are going to get to a family, and conservatives need to find a way to live with that. When it comes to functioning adults, or even partially functioning ones, we can let democracy work. But when it comes to children, we are stuck with bureaucracy. The question, though, is how to ensure that these involuntary forms of paternalism do not turn into Dickensian institutions and that they are run in such a way as to give these children the advantages they need instead of warehousing them to keep their disadvantages out of public view. We should encourage some no-excuse model and parochial schools to expand their capabilities, whether that means providing more counseling for students or showing them how to live in a family, or help them with medical care, or provide them with a place to live. Parochial schools, I think, because of their missions, may be best equipped to handle this kind of education, but charter schools can also accomplish a lot. Lest conservatives worry that all this talk about trauma-informed care and social-emotional learning is code for lower academic standards, the leadership, I think, at Haven and Monument know that the schools have an important academic mission as well. Many of the kids come to these schools already behind in their classes. They have missed significant amounts of school because of being transferred among schools, and both because of their moves to different homes as well as behavioral problems. And even children who are capable of doing work have so often been placed in special education classes because of their behavioral questions that they can't get the education they deserve. There is no single public policy answer to helping at-risk kids succeed in school, but part of it is certainly choice. Arizona, Florida, and North Carolina all have voucher programs for kids in foster care to attend private schools. I think those programs should be expanded to other states as well. Oklahoma recently did so. The federal government also helps children who were in foster care to be able to afford college. The Chafee grant finances vouchers of up to $5,000 per year for former foster care children and those scholarships are administered by the states. Maybe you're wondering whether a college scholarship is really going to move the needle, but I want to tell you a quick story. A middle-class mother I was talking to recently in Brooklyn told me that her only son actually had just graduated from high school and gone to college and had moved out of the house, and she was actually thinking about foster care. But she had a little extra room in her apartment, and she actually asked me how she would afford college for another child. Ensuring that states put money into an educational account that follows the child rather than depending on foster families to foot these costs is a vital part of caring for these young people. Doing so will make fostering and adopting out of foster care actually seem more feasible for many middle-class parents who wouldn't want to give these children any less than they would give their biological children. Not every one of these children will go to college. Last year, America Works signed a contract with New York City's Human Resources Administration to aid hundreds of former foster youths in Brooklyn and the Bronx. The 4-decade-old organization believes that the first step to getting people to be independent, productive citizens is getting them a job. There is a temptation for conservatives to avoid talking about the educational options for the most at-risk kids. Because we believe that parents are the best arbiters of decisions about their children's education, we have not fully engaged with the question of what to do with kids who do not have an adult presence in the home. The concern about getting public schools too involved in the personal and family lives of students has also made us wary about the institutions that serve these kids in a more complete way. And finally, our worries that a focus on the social emotional aspect of kids' lives will detract from giving them the academic tools they need to succeed has kept many of us from fully engaging with the questions of how schools can heal the wounds that these vulnerable kids have suffered. Fortunately, there's no time like the present. Thank you very much.
Really well done, Naomi. Thank you
you.
so much. You also incidentally kept within our suggested time limit admirably, and so we appreciate that as well. Let me just mention that the David Whitman book, Sweating the Small Stuff, that Naomi referenced a couple times, is a Fordham publication that is still available for anybody that wants to track it down. It was a close look at the so-called paternalism issue in mostly no excuses charter schools and other schools, and still well worth a look. So I got a lot of questions. I suspect people here do too. Let me note that the avoidance of tough issues that you alluded to at the end is exactly what this 2020 project is all about. We're trying to get people to think about things they haven't been necessarily thinking about or wanting to think about in recent years. So this is, I'm really glad you said that too. You told me earlier before today, but once we, Fordham, started characterizing your paper as a choice isn't a silver bullet paper, you started getting the equivalent of hate mail from people who think that choice is a silver bullet for all kids. Can you tell whether any of the folks that are sending you hate mail think that choice really works for the kids you're talking about? Did they have anything at all persuasive to say to you on that point?
No, I mean, I think they didn't, and this is the problem with advertising things on Twitter is people just read the headlines. And
I never tweet. That's all Mike.
Okay, well, I'll blame Mike then. But I think that we have to, be very accurate about the population we're describing, because I think the people's first assumption is when I say, the most vulnerable kids, they just assume I'm talking about poor kids, and I'm not. I mean, this is not just an economics issue. There are poor kids in this country, millions of them, who have stable, responsible adult presences in their lives. And so I'm not generalizing about them. And for them, I think that, choice probably is as close as we're going to get to a silver bullet. So I think part of it was just a misunderstanding of the group that I was talking about. And part of it is just, I've certainly been outspoken for the last, couple of decades about my support of choice, and I suspect that people, thought, oh,
traitor.
Yes, that I'd gone soft, but I assure you have not.
Thank you. I'm glad you haven't.
Yeah.
But I'm also glad that you're thinking about this this other population, the smaller population of kids we haven't been thinking much about. So I legitimately and properly praise the no excuses model, charter schools, Catholic schools, and so forth, for its kind of tough love approach to education and its high standards and focus on academics and things like that. But then in talking about the population you're concerned about, you also introduce what a lot of people call the soft skills, the social emotional stuff, the teddy bears, the quiet corners. And things that to some hardline, no excuses people sound squishy and kind of emotional rather than rigorous and tough. But the schools you described seem to be reconciling these two tendencies. They manage to be both sort of rigorous academically, but also soft when it comes to the emotional stuff. Can these things be reconciled?
I think it's a struggle, and the leaders of schools who cater to this population will tell you that it's a struggle, and they often find themselves going too far in one direction and then the next year trying to correct, based on test scores or just based on their sense of what the school environment is like. It is a really difficult balance, because I think these kids cannot succeed without, social emotional skills is something, and it's just talked about so broadly, and there's not enough really academically rigorous research that's been done on it, that I hesitate to say it's kind of a cure-all, but we do need to find a way to get these kids to function in some way. I mean, if you're not used to living in a functional family and you don't have any idea how to sit, civilly with somebody at lunch and ask them to politely pass the potatoes, frankly, that is going, it's a joke, but it's not a joke, but
real.
you're not,
real.
that is not going to help you, even if we can figure out a way to make you college or career ready. I mean, trying to figure out a way, these are some very basic social and emotional skills that a lot of these kids are lacking. And so I'm not sure what the exact proper program is for getting them to be able to do that. I do suspect that certainly leaving aside all of these, different programs that people are trying, just the basic act of being able to sit at a lunch table or at a dinner table or live in a home with other kids and other adults and understand chores and responsibilities and consequences. If some way we can get them to be able to do that, I think would be certainly the right path down this road, even if these other more experimental, like will giving them teddy bears teach them empathy questions are still up in the air.
So learning algebra isn't enough if you can't also pass the potatoes, so to speak.
That's right, yes.
Okay, but it's a balancing act. There's a tension there and a balancing act, and educators, in my experience, tend to sort of be on one side or the other of this view. You found some who obviously are trying to straddle it, trying to do both.
Yeah, I think that they certainly recognize that success for these kids will involve both of these things. But, the problem with any school is always, there are a limited number of hours in the day. Obviously, schools with longer school days are going to have more options. Boarding schools are going to have more options for this sort of thing. But at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, how many hours do we want to devote to this? I think some people will try to sort of bridge this divide by saying, well, part of it has to do with the way we teach students, and if we could teach students algebra by also showing them how they should respect each other, that would be great too. But I think some of these softer skills are just for this population of kids. Again, I'm not talking about whether we should teach typical middle-class kids who are having anxiety about their phones or whatever more social emotional skills during the day. I'm really talking about a population of kids that is not getting that at home.
Not getting it at home, okay. Let's pause on the boarding school issue, because you cited one that I don't know about. I know about the seed schools, of which I think there are 2 or 3 now. Other than sort of strange outlying situations like the Milton S. Hershey School, there are a very tiny number of boarding schools for severely disadvantaged kids that provide this 5-day-a-week or 7-day-a-week. And I admire them to the extent that I know about them. They're very expensive is one consideration, but is it a scalable thing? Or are we just going to continue to have these occasional, very rare specimens in a few places?
So a couple of things. I mean, anyone who talks about this population always has to sort of look at the costs at the other end. If you don't help these kids, I mean, it sounds like a cliche, but if you don't help these kids now, the cost to society of these kids when they're 18 and over is astronomical. Whether you're counting the amount of money we spend on prisons or mental health services or drug rehabilitation, all of these things are things that are going to cost society either at the beginning or the end. But I think even more importantly than that, this doesn't have to be a scalable model in the same way that we talk about scalable models for poor kids. Because we are talking about, it's a lot of kids, but when you break it down by state, I don't think it's an insurmountable problem. And the state is already giving a lot of money to this population in the form of, IEPs or, in the form of special education. So I think some of the money is already there. The other thing that I think was really interesting about talking to some of the leaders of these boarding schools, Monument, as I mentioned, is that the 5-day-a-week program in particular often allows the adults who are in their lives, who are relatively stable, to sort of remain in the picture, which is to say, if you have like great aunt so-and-so, who's, kind of a little bit elderly, but
she
really
can do
cares.
it on the weekend.
Right, but really cares about this 14-year-old boy who's in her life. She can take responsibility for him as long as she doesn't have to be going to school every other day to talk to the principal about his behavior and try to find him a new school when he gets kicked out. So it makes the presence of these other adults, I think, more manageable.
Good point, because in effect, at least in the seed model, I don't know Monument, they come home on the weekend, so it's sort of 2 days a week instead of 7 that the adults are directly responsible for them. I was trying to do some quick numbers while you were talking. I mean, there are roughly 55 million school kids in America today. It sounded like the numbers you were using add up to about 1 million. What would be your guesstimate for the size of the population that you're talking about?
I think, probably a couple of million, between 1 and 2 million, let's say, of
Okay.
kids who are going in and out of that at-risk.
So 3 or 4% of the school age population is what that comes out to, I believe, if I'm doing my math right, which is a manageable. I mean, considering there's 13% of the kids in special ed out of that population, and something like 10% in private schools, and something like 6%, I think, in charter schools. So we're talking about a relatively small number, as you said. So it maybe is affordable to think about doing some extra, some extra.
Right.
Okay.
What they call wraparound.
Wraparound.
Yes.
For a population that's a little hard to define, isn't it? It'd be hard to define eligibility for these additional services, wouldn't it be?
That's true, right. You couldn't give like a competence test to adults, school children, and see if they pass or not. But I do think, I mean, the state already identifies these kids in other ways.
In other ways.
I just think that they do, I mean, most of the child welfare bureaucracies, I don't think are doing a great job of handling these kids' needs. They often talk about how overstretched they are. I don't necessarily think they even have the right policies or capabilities to deal with some of these things. I mean, if you're just, you know, depending on a child welfare caseworker to, you know, manage dental appointments and mental health counseling and all of these things, I think the school at least is in one place. They're dealing with the kid day in and day out, trying to work, because what the child welfare bureaucracy is doing is all of these things are being worked through the unstable adults. So you have to get a hold of mom on the phone and say, you know, we have a report that your child's, you know, teeth need fixing. We have a report that your child's breathing is having, you know, could you make a doctor's appointment? Here's the name of a doctor. And then you have some child welfare bureaucrat who's then trying to follow. I think that is a task where you're putting the irresponsible adult between that child and getting the care that they need.
Okay, got it. So let's talk about irresponsible adults in the context of your suggestion that schools can, to some extent, replicate what families do for these children, or should do for these children. I can hear two conservative objections to the school as family idea.
Only two?
Well, two obvious ones. The first and simplest is that, of course, schools can't possibly do what families do because they're just not up to it. They don't have the kids enough. They don't have the competence. They don't have the love. They don't have a bunch of things. The harder challenge is the conservative concern that the more institutions try to substitute for families, the more we will weaken families, that this will actually have a long-term deleterious effect on families, rather than help, in addition to perhaps helping kids that need them in the short run. We will create greater dependency on institutions in the long run and be damaging to families in the long run when we make it, in effect, easier for semi-competent parents to slough off their responsibilities that they should shoulder onto institutions that serve their kids instead. That's a hard one to rebut, I think. How do you think about it?
Well, I think obviously the best cases of schools doing this are religious schools. I don't think we have any evidence that when religious schools come in and try to help families or help provide them with whatever it is they need, whether it's, you know, help putting food on the table or counseling or babysitting or whatever, that this has sent a message to the rest of the community that don't worry about it, we'll take care of your kids no matter what. But obviously the public situation is a different one. You know, I will say that, you know, even at the No Excuses charter schools, I mean, I hear stories of, you know, a child lands in a hospital and it's the whole fourth grade class and the teacher that decides to go visit them. And that child, there's no adult visiting that child in the hospital. In the schools that are really trying to at least, they can't replace the family. I acknowledge that. But they are going to be the most stable presence. And, you know, some states don't even have, I think most states now allow kids who have been removed from their family or have had to go to a different foster family to remain in the same school. But that's actually a fairly recent development. A lot of times, if you were pulled out of X school,
you had to just go to school in the new neighborhood of the new foster family. So at least to create some kind of stability. And so these teachers, if you find, a caring teacher, a school that genuinely is concerned about the home life of these kids, they can provide some of that. No, I don't think that they can, replace the whole thing. But, the incentive structure is a problem, and that's why obviously I prefer charter schools because there's a little bit more of a removal from the bureaucracy, and I prefer religious schools because there's much greater removal from the bureaucracy. And I think that will, sort of cut down on the disincentives you're talking about.
Okay. I've got about 2 more questions, and then we're going to open this up. So all of you, please be thinking about what you want to ask Naomi in our remaining time with her. This is Washington, so I got to ask, is there any federal role here? You alluded briefly to some federal program or policy. Is there something the federal government has anything to do with or to say about? I know there's a federal law for homeless children in schools, but I'm not aware, and I know there's federal programs bearing on foster care, but I don't know whether the nexus of issues that you're talking about has a federal element to it.
It's very hard to say. I mean, the foster care issue generally is a state issue. There's some federal funding that comes in through Title 4E. We just had a big fight/compromise in Congress where we passed the Families First legislation, which offers states money toward preventive services for kids who are at risk. It's possible that those kind of funds could be used in this way. I mean, it's a very tiny piece of the pie, and I think this is going to be an area which conservatives will like to hear, where there's going to have to be some, I think, state experimentation with this. It would be nice to see if there was a federal incentive to do more of that experimentation. This is more your department than mine, but I think that generally speaking, with these kids, the more local efforts you can get, the better. I don't think this is a federal government problem to solve at this point.
Okay. So you made me think, while you were talking of 2 famous children's books, both of which start with M. You're probably acquainted with them both. Do you remember Madeline, the girl in France,
Yes.
2 straight lines? And I believe she ended up in the hospital. And as I recall, the nun brought all the other kids to visit her in the hospital, didn't they?
Yes, they did.
Remembering that right?
Yeah. They were war orphans, or their parents were. The father.
That's
were
right.
All in at war.
At war.
Yes.
And so these little girls lived in a dormitory in a Catholic school, right?
Yep.
12 little girls in 2 straight lines. I think that's okay.
That's correct.
The other, your reference to Dickensian institutions. Do you know Matilda, the Roald Dahl book, and the play and I think movie that came out of it?
Yes. Yes.
Talk about a Dickensian institution.
Yes.
This is not what you're recommending.
No, this is not what I'm recommending. And I don't, I think obviously there are a lot of reasons, and the Indian boarding schools I mentioned is one of them, that we have this kind of aversion
yes.
to the idea of boarding schools in this way. I mean, not, of course, elite boarding schools, although those have their own problems, but I think that, any solution that involves this will have to get over some of that problem, and maybe the 5-day boarding program is a way to say, we're not just sending these kids off. There is going to be some accountability. There are going to be people in their lives who know whether or not this is working. I think that could be one answer to the aversion to boarding schools.
Yeah, the Indian experience, the Australian equivalent with the Aboriginal schools, these situations where essentially the government decided to take their culture away from them and nationalize them in some way. It has left bad taste in a lot of mouths and bad memories. And this, of course, we'll run into the issue of the same kinds of issues of pluralism that already affect adoption laws. Can a kid be cared for by a person of another color, for example, or a teacher of another color, for example, in their school?
Yeah.
We will continue to have to struggle with those issues. All right, I am out for the time being. It is your turn. Who in the group gathered here would like to ask Naomi a question? And there's a microphone coming to you. And since we are being recorded for future viewing, identify yourself, please.
My name is Sheikh Kitiri. I'm a graduate student at SAIS. My question is for you about the role of the civil society for these kids who don't have a stable home, and how can, and I'm a conservative, this is boiling my own blood to say this, but how can we use government incentives to encourage members of community and intermediary institutions and people within them to play that role for these kids, if at all?
Yeah. Well, I think civil society has clearly failed these kids. I mean, we didn't really have a foster care system, 60 years ago, because generally they would be these are kids who would be taken in by the extended family or neighbors or something if there was really nobody available for them. So these are kids whose parents really don't have a social network. They don't have religious community or a neighborhood that is concerned about these kids. And so I'm not sure, that we can recreate that. Obviously, what a lot of these kids need are foster and adoptive families. And that's, a separate question that I'm writing about as well. And for those people, I don't think, frankly, that financial incentives are the question. It's funny, I was recently asked by an editor about this. I wrote a piece that had to do with foster and adoptive agencies or faith-based institutions in Arkansas that were handling this problem. And the editor wrote back saying, shouldn't government be doing all of this? I'll let you figure out what the publication was. And I wrote back and I said, well, government sort of has two tools at its disposal. It can either sort of force people to do things by law, and I don't think we want to sort of go knocking on people's doors saying you must take in a foster child, or it can dangle money in front of people. And I think that, frankly, we don't want to be in a situation where people who are otherwise not going to take orphans into their homes suddenly decide to do so because you've offered them a few $100s. And I think that is actually, in some cases, the situation that we're facing now. So I don't think that this is you'll be surprised to know, a problem that government can solve, at least on that end.
Carl Polzer. Very interesting ideas. Just wanted to challenge the idea that just because agents of God are involved, these are automatically going to be a safe place for kids. Just look what's happening with the Catholic Church trying to clean up its own house. I mean, if they can't keep their hands off the kids in the church, what about when they're at the boarding school? So I worked a lot in an industry with vulnerable adults, assisted living, nursing homes, and what we end up with is a supervisor. You need a regulatory system, some kind of ombudsman, or if you're going to have these kids put in these outside institutions, that's another problem that the conservatives might have, is what kind of regulation would you need to ensure their safety?
Good question.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think this is definitely the problem that you see in institutions with adults who have challenges and any kind of boarding school institution. It's why I do like the 5-day model, because I think it provides some amount of accountability for what's going on at these schools and other kinds of institutions. But it's a really hard problem to solve. I mean, I think you create a regulatory body tomorrow, and who knows whether they would be able to spot these problems, or whether they would also sort of fall into the kind of I don't want to call it corruption, but just kind of laziness that that goes along with this, any kind of government regulatory body. So no, I don't think that just because an institution is religious that it will necessarily be the best place for a child. But I do think that a lot of the schools that I've looked at, anyway, of course, have long histories of helping very vulnerable children, and I think that they have, adopted more of this model of, we are going to partner with families and we're going to sort of be a child's extended family, and they feel much more freedom to be able to do that, and maybe more of a desire to do that than a typical public school might.
Sort of parenthetically, all the concern, understandable, legitimate concern about the Catholic Church and kids who've been abused, I'm not recalling a single example of that emerging from a parochial school setting, but rather from the church.
Well, you
settings.
had the Indian boarding schools, for instance, in Canada, were run by religious institutions.
True.
So
okay.
I don't think it's that's really the.
And those were boarding schools.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And most
Yes.
parochial schools, of course, as
Yeah.
we know them, are not. They're
Yeah.
day schools.
Yeah.
Okay. Who else? There was a hand up over here, Kevin. Oh, all right. We'll get to you.
Sorry. James Speller. In the 80s, I, for a couple of years, went to a boarding school which was almost exclusively, but not me, for kids in state care, full-time state care. And one of the things which they felt was super important was we did a lot of manual work. We did farm labor. I don't know if that is a big thing in the schools that you're talking about, or the idea was that kids who had a lot of emotional challenges would find it easier to live if they did that. But I feel like that farm labor for kids feels less progressive than other solutions.
Did you do your share? Can you grow things?
When I was a 9-year-old, yeah.
When pressed. That's an interesting model. I have not seen that model, but I mean, certainly you could see a more career or vocational school that would be great for these kids. I think there's a lot to be said for being able to work with your hands and kind of the emotional benefits that come with that. In addition to which, I think some of the schools have really tried to focus on getting kids outdoors more. Kids who have a real hard time like sitting still, being able to be in small spaces. Who have emotional problems kind of related to that. Making sure that they get more time outside to run around. I mean, maybe you would say this about all kids, but I think that the leaders of some of the schools I've talked to have really emphasized just the importance of being outside to helping with that. So maybe that would fit in.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Kevin Mencken, and I'm struck by some of the similarities between the kind of benevolent paternalism that you've described today and some of the favored, perhaps the favored education policy of the reform left, which is sometimes called community schools, which offer supplementary services, use the term wraparound services. In fact, only yesterday I was at an AFT event where the offering of these kinds of services, mental health, counseling, medical care, were propounded by none other than Randi Weingarten. And her other proposed solution was a lot of SEL.
Social emotional learning.
Social emotional learning and psychosocial skills. So I'm wondering if you can foresee kind of meeting of the minds in this respect around these kinds of solutions.
Yeah. Well, I think the first big difference is what I was saying to Jagger, which is that a lot of the wraparound services are designed to go through the parents. We could offer you this for your child. We could offer you these mental health counseling services. They're doing that for the adults too. And I think that some of that is getting lost on its way to the kids. Unless those adults are essentially a stable presence in their lives. But if you talked about the adults that I'm talking about in these situations, they cannot be depended on to actually even do the small amount of follow-through that we're talking about with these wraparound services. And they're not going to do them for themselves, and they're not going to do them for their kids in a lot of cases. And so that to me is one big difference. I don't know what the EFT was proposing, but in terms of the community schools that are doing some of these wraparound services, I think a lot of that is going through the parents and depending on them to follow through. In terms of the social emotional learning stuff, like I said, I think that a lot of the evidence is still out on the programs, on the ruler, on the teddy bears, on this other stuff. And so I don't know, I doubt, frankly, that Randi Weingarten is proposing that teachers sit with students at lunch and
pass the mashed potatoes?
And pass the mashed potatoes. And because this is going to require, frankly, at these schools, the teachers don't take the lunch is not a break. Lunch is, we're going to sit down and have this conversation. This is part of our learning. And it's interesting because if you go back, of course, to what elite kids used to get at schools, at boarding schools, whatever. It was a teacher sitting down, and we're all going to have our proper silverware, and we're going to learn. But now it's a much more basic version of that etiquette. But this is going to involve a whole lot more time and effort on the part of teachers to be able to do this for longer hours. I mean, these are. This is the no excuses charter school model too. This is these kids are going to be here until 5 or 6. These teachers are going to be here until 5 or 6 in the evening. This is an exhausting job, and it's really about fully engaging with this table of 7 or 8 kids. And I cannot be on my phone or thinking about my lesson plan while I'm doing it. This is my job.
I have a granddaughter in a traditional boarding school, and I think it's all cafeteria style now. I'm not aware
It
that
is,
teachers
yeah.
ever sit down with the mashed
Yes,
potatoes.
but-
Though I think you can sit down with them if you bump into them in the cafeteria.
you're paying
I think
for.
they're open to that. We have time for one, maybe two more questions before we take a very short break in between our two baseball games. Yes.
Hi, sorry, right back here. But first of all, thank you very much.
Who are you?
Sorry, Emily Bloomfield, I'm Monument Academy CEO.
Ah.
So, and anybody's welcome to visit. But I would certainly underscore what you say. And I think, my question is really about whether you're seeing a growing interest as you've traveled around in looking at models, different models that really address the needs of these children. Because I would say to your kind of the question from a conservative perspective about sort of family dependency and taking this on, I think these are always second best solutions, but the family is typically often incapacitated or the source of harm for children. And so it's really trying to create that buffer that a typical family might be able to provide. And on the teaching the skills, I think what schools like us are doing are teaching explicitly skills that are typically taught at home, how to take turns, how to be polite, how not to punch somebody when you get frustrated. And schools can't get to the academics until they do that because kids are not attending to their learning. And then the other thing I would just say to underscore your point about is it expensive? It is expensive, but the ROI is, I think, what you're referring to. And one data point is it costs $245,000 to incarcerate a youth every year in D.C. So this is far less expensive, and these are children who are typically on that periphery of the school-to-prison pipeline. So the prevention of that is actually a large short-term savings, not to mention the ROI down the line of incarceration, mental health, et cetera. So I am interested, are more states thinking about that, especially with the growing numbers of kids reentering, or those preventive services were for kids who were previously removed, but they're still in families that are really facing a lot of challenges. And
So-
the more, are you seeing that happen?
While you have the mic, how many kids in your school?
130.
And what's the age range?
Ours is 5th through 8th grade. So middle school is actually when a lot of our students would typically start dropping out of school and often don't show up in high school. Many do, but a number don't. Yeah.
And if you don't mind, what's the unit cost, the per child per year approximate budget?
So for us, it's around, and we're boarding.
understand.
So just it's important to know over 50% of our kids have IEPs, and most of those are special education
Yeah,
plans and
right.
full-time. So we're roughly 60,000, but 20% of our budget goes just to pay for our facilities. So if we didn't,
Yeah. Okay.
Just
Go ahead.
to answer the question quickly, I don't see a lot of growing interest in the school models, and I think one reason for that is that these are two very separate bureaucracies, the school bureaucracy and the child welfare bureaucracy. There is very little communication, and so even the schools that are really trying to, help kids and figure out what they can do to improve the situation at home, they often don't get information that they need out of the child welfare bureaucracy, and the child welfare bureaucracy doesn't turn around and say, hey, school, could you, help us with this, that, or the other thing. Instead, they're providing counseling or other services outside of the school that have to be arranged in other ways. So I think it would be great if states started thinking of these two institutions as working in concert for these kids, but right now there's just a big separation.
A parallel point that needs to be made, because it comes up every time anyone makes the sort of ROI argument, which is an absolutely legitimate argument. But we have to keep in mind that the people that vote on budgets and appropriations for the prisons are not the same people that vote on budgets and appropriations for the schools. And so the ROI calculation can be made in think tanks, but it never actually faces the people who are creating budgets and appropriations in any level of government that I'm aware of. How that can be made clearer to those who do budgeting and stuff like that, I have no idea. But that's a worthy project for the next project. Okay. First of all, join me in thanking Naomi for a terrific presentation.
Thank you.
And we are going to take about a 3-minute stretch break. There's water and coffee and a few more sandwiches, and then we are going into the second round of our doubleheader.
Good afternoon. I am Mike Petrilli. I'm the president of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute and a visiting fellow here at the Hoover Institution. And I'm excited that I get to moderate the second game in our doubleheader, our conversation with Jonah Goldberg about civics education. For those of you who are not from ed reform world, just like education world, we are very susceptible to fads. This will not come as a great surprise to you. It was not so long ago that we were all obsessed with college. College. That was what we were about, was getting more kids, maybe all kids, to and through college. Then a few years ago, we started thinking, maybe that doesn't make complete sense, that everybody needs to go to college. Maybe careers actually are important as well. Maybe career and technical education, if it's high quality, not such a bad thing. So then we started talking about college and career. But those two C's, of course, leave out another C, which is citizenship. Famously, way back when America's public education system was being built, that was one of the major arguments, was that we needed schools in order to build citizens, particularly important in a democracy. And it is only recently, you could argue, since many education reformers woke up in November 2016 to the Trump presidency, that there's been this renewed interest in civics education. On the left, when you hear these conversations about how civics education is broken, it often comes down to if it weren't broken, we wouldn't have voted for Donald Trump. That obviously is problematic in many respects to come at it from that perspective. But I think there are certainly folks from across the ideological spectrum who share this nagging belief that something seems to be wrong in terms of how we are teaching history and civics and preparing the next generation of citizens coming out of our schools. So Jonah's going to dig into all of this today, and I hope that we can have a robust conversation about, first of all, what is the problem that we think we are trying to address here, and how might we go about this better going forward. Jonah barely needs an introduction in this room, but I will give it to him anyways. Briefly, Jonah Goldberg is a fellow and Asness Chair in Applied Liberty at the American Enterprise Institute. He is also a senior editor at National Review, and he is a best-selling author and columnist. His newest book is Suicide of the West. I highly recommend it. I read it, Jonah, together with Steven Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now, and I have to say, it's really fun to read those two books together and to have folks on the right and the left both making this argument that over the past 300 years, we have made incredible progress in virtually all respects. And yet we have a moment right now when so many people throughout the West, certainly here in America, feel like everything is going to hell in a handbasket. And why is it that we have this disconnect at a time where there is so much prosperity and so much to be grateful for? We feel like the politics are moving in such a different direction. So I highly recommend that. And in that book, he gets into some of these issues around how we teach our young people about our founding and about the gifts that our founders gave to us. So with that, let's hear from Jonah Goldberg. Take it away.
One of my standard rules about speeches is never talk to an audience that knows more about a subject than you do, at least not about the subject that they all know about. I once gave a talk to a group of the Trade Association for Large Earth-Moving Equipment Manufacturers. And the first question out of the box was whether or not the next Congress was going to carry over the depreciation of the Title VI, Queen Astray, Framfra of the what. I had no idea what he was talking about. And so one of my decisions here is to sort of Kobayashi Maru this a little bit and talk about the stuff that I actually know about rather than get into the weeds on the stuff that you all know about. I clearly do not know. There are plenty of people who know a lot more about education than I do, and I want to thank all you guys for sticking around for the second half of this. I know there's more of a constituency for school choice issues and whatnot in Washington than there is in civics, which I think is telling. And fake news will never reveal how big this crowd is, which I really appreciate. So, so I'm going to do this a little more informally, but and as Henry VIII said to each of his wives, I won't keep you long. But let's let's survey just a few data points here. More than a third of Americans surveyed by the Annenberg Center for Public Policy in September of 2017 failed to name a single freedom enumerated in the First Amendment of the Constitution. Only 26% of respondents could name all three branches of government. That was down from 38% in 2011. 33% could not name a single branch of government. Only one respondent out of more than 1,000 surveyed by the Freedom Forum could name all five freedoms protected by the First Amendment, but 9% said they believed it protected the right to bear arms. According to a survey by the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation, just over a third, 36% of Americans can pass a multiple choice test consisting of items taken from the U.S. citizenship test. A passing score is 60%. More than two-thirds were unable to identify the 13 colonies that ratified the Constitution. Less than a quarter could answer the question why we fought the British. Sorry, James. Only a quarter, 24%, could name a single thing Benjamin Franklin was famous for, and a third believed he invented the light bulb. Interestingly, people 65 and older had a much higher pass rate on these sorts of things than young people did. 74% of people over the age of 65 passed, while only 19% of people under the age of 45 passed. So the children are getting worse, not better, or the youngins are. Now, that's the only data I've got for you in this whole thing. And where I want to go is somewhere a little different. Michael brought up Steven Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now, which I think is a good book and it's a useful book. But where I think he gets things wrong is that he basically has this attitude of everything that is good in the last 300 years is about the Enlightenment and reason, and everything that is bad is not the Enlightenment and is about unreason or badness. And he also treats the Enlightenment like it was a single thing. There were actually a bunch of different Enlightenments. There was a German Enlightenment. There was a French Enlightenment, which did not go great. There was the English Enlightenment. There was an American Enlightenment. I used to have the standard policy when talking about Enlightenments, borrowed from the movie So I Married an Axe Murderer, that when it comes to Enlightenments, if it's not Scottish, it's crap. But that's probably a little too glib because there are good parts of some of them. But the reason I bring this up is that there is a tendency when we talk about the Enlightenment, there's a tendency among eggheads and intellectuals and think tankers, ideas defining a free society is a very conservative think tanky way of formulating things, is to focus almost entirely on reason and on ideas. And the truth is that for most of human history, the way we understood things was through stories. The human brain is wired to understand things through stories. We didn't have written language until fairly recently in the evolutionary record. And until then, almost all knowledge was passed along through one story of one sort or another. The Bible is many things, but at its most basic level, it's a collection of stories. Every significant moral event in your life, every life lesson you've ever had, has a story attached to it. That's how we understand things. That's how we communicate things. And my thesis is that the way to understand civics is not to talk about it as if it is a product of this sort of Enlightenment, mechanistic understanding about the way we arrange institutions, or you want to call it, sort of the watchmaker approach or any of these kinds of things. It's a story. It's simply the story we tell about who we are as a country, why we are the way we are as a country. A civilization is really nothing more than the story we tell ourselves about ourselves. It's a narrative. And when you don't tell the story the right way, or when you don't tell the story at all, or when you rewrite the story, you get consequences from that. And so part of my obsession these days is focusing on how we're messing up the storytelling. And, part of the argument I make in the chapter that I'm working on for these guys is I begin with recounting the story of Goldfinger, a classic James Bond film, for those of you old enough to remember it, or have watched it in reruns 1,000 times. Now, first thing I should note before we get into the actual details of it, I recently rewatched the movie Goldfinger, and I was stunned how, I'll be blunt, how rapey James Bond was in it. So we'll just put that aside. But for those of you who don't remember the movie Goldfinger, the villain of Goldfinger is a guy who does not want to rob Fort Knox. Spoiler alert, the whole movie is set up as if he's going to rob Fort Knox, and it turns out that's not his plan. What he wants to do is set off a dirty bomb inside of Fort Knox and irradiate all of the gold inside of Fort Knox, thereby making it impossible to bring to market, making therefore gold economically more scarce and his already huge stockpile infinitely more valuable. And to me, this is sort of metaphorically or narratively very similar to what the Howard Zinns of the world want to do. If you read Howard Zinn's People's History of America, he basically openly and unabashedly says that the story he is going to tell is from the perspective of the victims. Slaves, the Irish slums, the coal miners, the Trail of Tears, all of these sorts of things. And these are the only stories that matter, according to Zinn and his History of America. And that mindset, to one extent or another, that way of telling the story of America has taken over vast swaths of intellectual life. And when I say intellectual life, I don't just mean in terms of college educators or even education writ large, but also Hollywood, popular fiction, journalism. All of these things are infected with this idea that the only important stories to tell about America are about the stories that reflect poorly on the idea of America or that highlight white supremacy and all of these kinds of things. And I should point out, since it's sort of relevant to our first talk this afternoon, this is very common in high-end elite high schools and grade schools on the East Coast. I always try to tell people, look, school choice is great for a lot of things, and it may not solve people who are in special needs at the bottom of the socioeconomic or cultural ladder. It also doesn't solve these issues. I have school choice. I spend, I'll tell you, about $40,000 a year to send one kid to high school. And any elite school in the Washington, D.C. area would largely subscribe to these kinds of ideas about America. There is no elite school I'm aware of. Some are better than others, but none have remotely as far as I am aware, a truly sort of patriotic understanding of American history. And there's a reason why for it. I am kind of obsessed these days with Joseph Schumpeter. And for those of you who don't know, he was an Austrian economist, although he never gets labeled with the Austrian economist. And in his book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, he prophesied the end of capitalism's doom. And his argument, he sort of turned Marx on his head. He said it wasn't going to be the proletariat that was going to rip up the paving stones and tear down the bourgeoisie and the ruling classes. It was actually going to be the children of the ruling classes. That there is something in a sort of Hegelian dialectic embedded in how capitalism evolves over time, where you start out with incredibly impressive robber baron types, men of action, right? Schumpeter gets a lot of this from Nietzsche and the genealogy of morals, which we don't have to get too deep into. But you start with men of action, very poorly educated, if educated at all. I think it was Vanderbilt who said his entire life he read only one book, and he read it when he was 70 years old. And so you get these sort of the robber baron types who make incredible fortunes, captains of industry. They build up essentially secular dynasties of wealth. And then they have kids. And what they do is they overeducate their kids, and they turn them into lawyers. And then in the third generation, they become, poets. I think Warren Buffett's grandson is a spoken word poet or something. And part of the reason for it is that as you get more wealthy, you rely on education not to make sure your kids get rich, but as a hedge against them getting poor. And so you have, this is the story of my people. The Jews do not make their kids become doctors and lawyers because they want them to be rich. They want to make sure that they won't be poor. And so what happens is you start having this dynamic, not just among the super captains of industry, but you have it among sort of the mass affluent classes in this country, where they overeducate their kids. And Schumpeter predicted this in, I think, 46, even before or 44, even before the GI Bill comes along. And he said what was going to happen is you're going to create a mass class of intellectuals, what's commonly called the new class, of intellectuals who will, like Nietzsche's priests, try to, through the process of what he called resentment, which is just the French way of saying resentment, they will try to undermine the existing society. That intellectuals will be the storytellers of our civilization, and they will tell a different story of our civilization, undermining our civilization. And we have seen this, I think, unfold almost inexorably over the last 50, 75 years. We now have a mass class of new class types. James Burnham called them the managerial class, of people who are in the industries that are involved in shaping ideas, manipulating images, telling stories, and they are telling this, essentially, to one extent or another, this Zinnian story of America. This story where we hold up the worst aspects of our story and say this reflects the whole thing. And so what I would like to do is just offer very briefly an alternative way about talking about civics. Yeah, by all means, you got to talk about 3 branches of government and all these kinds of things and what the Federalist Papers are and what the First Amendment does. That's all great. But at the most fundamental level, you need to tell the story of America as a story that includes all of the terrible stuff. All the stuff that Zinn talks about, I want to be taught. But you need to put it in the right context. If you don't teach the bad stuff, you cannot tell the story of overcoming the bad stuff. It absolutely must be said that slavery was a profound moral evil. And you can't have a conversation until you concede that. You should also put in the context that what was interesting about slavery in the United States in a grand historical sweep of things wasn't that we had it, but that we got rid of it. Because slavery has been a human institution, not throughout humanity's existence, but at least since the agricultural revolution. And so the second point is once you admit that it's an evil, the more interesting point is that it was profoundly hypocritical. The Founding Fathers were deep-seated hypocrites as a group, not every individual one, because they wrote this document that said all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and then they didn't grant these rights to women, they didn't grant them to a lot of people who didn't own property, they certainly didn't grant them to slaves. It's grotesque moral hypocrisy going on there. But the irony is that there's a great thing about hypocrisy. You can only be a hypocrite if you have principles. If you have no principles, you have nothing to fall short of, right? If Hannibal Lecter didn't think it was good to eat people, he would be a hypocrite if he ate people, but he did, so he could live down to his principles. In a society that has begun with this idea that says that we are all endowed by our creator, this was, in a sense, this time bomb in the story of America. And it's interesting, when the Declaration was written, the interesting and exciting part around the world was not the stuff at the beginning. That was basically Jefferson on a writer's deadline, right? The interesting stuff was the end. Independence from England. That was the news. The beginning was filler. And then what you get at the Gettysburg Address is you get Abraham Lincoln coming forward and basically not so much rewriting, but crystallizing the actual through line, which is this idea that our 77 years ago, our forefathers came forth on this nation to give birth to a new idea that we are all endowed with continent and liberty, and I can't quote the Gettysburg Address off the top of my head, which I probably should at some point, and more civics education. But he, in effect, made the beginning of the Declaration the important part. 100 years later, you get Martin Luther King, almost literally exactly 100 years later, coming to the March on Washington, not far from here, and what he does is he appeals to white America, a phrase I cannot stand, but he appeals to white Americans and says, you are falling short of the story you tell yourselves about yourselves. You are falling short of your best selves. And he says, that he says, when the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This idea that, as he put it, we are all endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, including black men, was a way of pinging the sense of historical and hypocritical guilt of white America and telling people to live up to your best standards if you want to be consistent. The problem that we have now is that we no longer talk about these ideal. Look, we've had debates on college campuses and everywhere else about where to draw the lines on various policies and principles forever, right? Take free speech on college campuses. The debates over where to draw the lines on free speech have been around forever. The problem that we have today is that the very idea of free speech is now considered illegitimate. The idea of free speech is seen as a tool of oppression, a tool of the patriarchy or white supremacy. Identity politics now is taken as is something that we teach from a very young age. We are taking the unum out of e pluribus and only talking about the pluribus. And we tell people that their identity and their meaning is caught up in the color of their skin. And so now the argument that we are taught, the story that we tell, is that Martin Luther King's appeal to judging people by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin is either it's taken out of context and you don't really understand what he was saying, or that the very principle of colorblindness is somehow suspect or somehow illegitimate. And so we are making the very ideals that we never fully lived up to, but we've been getting closer and improving towards throughout the history of this country, where instead of saying, hey, we've still got a way to go, we are now teaching kids that those very ideals are no longer things that should be considered ideals. And that's a suicidal choice, as I would argue. And I mean, it's amazing on Twitter, if you mention the word colorblindness, even to mean like literally colorblindness, like can't see red or green or something like that, it takes about 5 minutes for the waters to get chummed and people to start screaming, you don't understand, colorblindness is a social construct that is demeaning to people of color and blah, 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 blah. It's like the very word colorblindness is now considered illegitimate. And so what I would like to see in terms of civics in this country is just figuring out a way to tell this story of America, the story of improvement, the story of getting better, the story of pointing out that what makes this country special isn't our sins, it's our ability to improve ourselves. And that is something that allows us you open yourself up to everybody. I'm very grateful to Yuval Levin for making this point, or at least he was the first one where it sort of penetrated my cranium, about how conservatism should be understood as a form of gratitude. You look around society and you look at the things that you feel are lovely or lovable or worth preserving or passing on to your children, and you say you want to protect these things. And if you don't teach gratitude, you teach the opposite you end up teaching the opposite of gratitude. And the opposite of gratitude is resentment. It's entitlement. And we are raising large cohorts of children, of elite kids, with this profound sense that the world owes them something, with this profound sense that they can take the world around them completely for granted and want more from it, and that someone else should be giving it to them. And that is a poisonous way to raise kids. I'm very taken with Jonathan Haidt's and Greg Lukianoff's coddling of the American mind, because I've made this argument for years that political correctness has been around for, depending on how you define the term or whatever, since the 1930s, certainly since the 1980s. And it never really took hold the way it has now. And the reason why is because if you are a sort of left-wing identity politics type academic, these are the kids you've been waiting for. These kids have been raised in a cultural and psychological milieu that makes them open to the ideas of things like trigger warnings, that makes them open to the idea that free speech is oppressive if it conflicts with your self-esteem. And so I agree very much with this notion. Donald Trump, he's a symptom of our problems. He's making some of those problems worse. But our real problems are way upstream of what's going on in Washington. They have to do with how we're raising our kids or how we're not raising our kids. They have to do with the breakdown of the family and the institutions that turn us from the barbarians we're born as into citizens. And the way you start, Hannah Arendt had that great line where she says, every generation Western civilization is being invaded by barbarians. We call them children. And you start civilizing the barbarians that are born into the civilization of your family. You don't do it with abstract principles of reason. You don't talk about the Enlightenment. You model behavior and you tell them stories. And we've given up on the process of telling people the kinds of stories that can fill them with a certain sense of gratitude for the world and the country that they're born into, but at the same time understand that there's more work yet to be done. Anyway, thank you all very much.
Powerful.
Oh, I don't know about that, but thank you.
All right.
We'll get you the best.
Now we'll get to the grilling.
Yeah.
So I'll start with some grilling, Jonah. So I find it all very compelling, and but then again, I also live here in Washington D.C., and I see the kind of what you've described in terms of how we raise children inside this bubble. But I wondered, is this a bubble? I mean, if you had to imagine, and you thought about how kids in the heartland are being taught American history from grade school up through high school, I mean, do you think that there's the same problem out there, that they are being taught the Howard Zinn version of history and not something that's more balanced? Is this just something that you're sensitive to because of where you live and
Yeah, I have a couple answers to that. One is I do think it's better out in quote-unquote flyover country, right? I was talking to my friend David French, who lives in a fairly rural county in Tennessee, and he says, his kids go to a high school, like just a high school, like a normal American high school. It's got its cross-section of rich and poor, races and all the rest, and they have very little of the PC stuff. Meanwhile, I have a friend who's a big Hollywood guy, showrunner in Hollywood, and he was telling me about how at his kids' school, they are pushing very hard the gender stuff, and they ask 9 and 10-year-olds, they ask 9 and 10-year-old boys, do you like girls? And if they give the answer, which in my day was the correct answer, which was, I don't know, they say, okay, so you're questioning. And so there is the disconnect kind of stuff. I would say part of the answer is, okay, that's a perfectly fine point, but at the same time, I actually worry a lot about how we raise elites. And I've probably been on 100 college campuses in the last 15 years, and at elite schools with all sorts of caveats and exceptions, these are the kids who are going to go on to run our institutions. These are the kids who are going to go on to be politicians and HR directors and teachers and academics. And first of all, they come out of college having imbibed a whole bunch of attitudes that they then pass along. I think you judge utopian movements by the values they accept. And I actually think that there's a certain kind of end of history attitude that you get at elite college campuses, where you want to live in a world where everything is provided for you. And the worst thing you can do is hurt someone's self-esteem. And at the same time, you think you're independent. Right? I mean, I always tell these college kids, let me get this straight. Your food is paid for, your clothing's paid for, your rent is paid for, your security is provided for, people cook for you, people clean for you, and you think you're independent? And so I think that mindset does a lot of damage. And we are increasingly living in a society where having a good work ethic and a strong back isn't enough anymore. And going on a sort of Schumpeterian analysis, one of the things I think that is messing up the country is that people don't understand how complexity is a subsidy. And the elite kids get out of schools, they're in these pipelines, and consciously or unconsciously, they're designing a society that is very easy to navigate for people with high levels of cognitive or social capital or financial capital, but very difficult to penetrate if not. And if you've got a lot of lawyers or if you've got a lot of contacts, it doesn't matter what new regulations come down the pike, you'll be fine. And the kids who come out of these schools where they're not all Zinnian, they don't learn the shibboleths, right? I mean, I'm convinced that's a big reason why these Asian kids are being discriminated about at Harvard. It's not because they don't like Asians. It's because they don't like kids who aren't necessarily interested in being, women's studies majors focusing on antebellum lesbian Moors. And they don't want engineers. They want woke Asians. And I think those sort of invisible status manipulations and sort of de facto aristocracies are a real problem.
But let's get back to K-12 and the
Sure.
system, 50 million kids out there. I mean, it seems likely, doesn't it, that right now what probably is happening is that you have in blue America the more Howard Zinn version of history being taught, and in red America something that's more patriotic. Is that okay?
On one level, look, I'm a huge fan of federalism, so that's okay. But it's not in a vacuum. The polarization that we're seeing today is across a broad. It's a social phenomenon, right? You now have partisan affiliation mapping populations almost the way religion or ethnicity did 100 years ago.
Right.
And the way these different school systems teach these things reinforces a lot of that. And so you get this attitude from the kids who come out of the blue state schools with a deep, abiding contempt and almost tribal hatred for the kids who come out of the red state schools. And the institutions, maybe not of K through 12, but certainly these ancillary institutions of cultural formation, of talk radio and all the rest, they're, one of the things that breaks my heart about this moment we're in is how many people on the right are abandoning the sort of classical liberal understanding of America, which is that you're supposed to take people as you find them, and instead they're coming up with their own right-wing version of identity politics. And that is in large part a response to the left-wing identity politics that has been pushed down them from a great height, but also through schools and elsewhere.
Yep. Now, some of our friends in the libertarian movement would look at all of this and say, look, it's impossible. If you're a school and you try to teach the story as you say, we're going to say warts and all, but the good stuff, the overcoming it, but also the bad stuff, you're never going to please everybody. You're going to get angry parents, and this is why we need school choice. We need to allow there to be different kinds of schools that approach this issue differently, and rather than trying to come to some kind of agreement around these hot-button cultural issues, we just let there be pluralism and diversity. Does that make sense to you?
Partly. I mean, look, I'm very much in favor of school choice or various competitive models, whether it's public school choice or charter schools. I don't follow all that closely, but I'm in favor of more competition as much as possible. I'm more in favor by just simply localism, of pushing as much power and responsibility down to the most local level possible. But again, there is this cultural sorting problem. The people who want to, Irving Kristol used to make this point all the time. People would say to him, well, shouldn't we have our own alternative conservative culture and our own conservative newspapers and magazines and TV networks and movie studios and all the rest? And Irving, who was a very close student of Schumpeter said, where are you going to get the people to run these things? Because the problem is that the people who are the sort of new class types, the people who are interested in manipulating ideas and images and telling stories, are disproportionately interested in going into fields like journalism and education. If you have a basic conservative outlook, you're more likely just, and this isn't about good or bad. There are lots of wonderful left-wing teachers and there are lots of wonderful, right-wing businessmen, but just the sociology of it is just very different. But what I would like to just, I think most of our problems are upstream of Washington. If you could send as much power down to the most local level possible, you might actually have people live up to their responsibilities. You also you'd still have things like culture wars, but at least the winners would have to look the losers in the eye the next day, which breeds a certain humility and understanding about who your opponents are. But so by all means, I'm not a big fan of, public sector unions, particularly teachers unions. I'm all in favor of sort of breaking up these kinds of monopolies. You're still going to need some kinds of oversight. But the people who want to go into these professions are, just as a sociological fact, more interested in telling these kinds of stories about what America is and who it is. I mean, again, I have school choice.
Yeah.
All the private schools in D.C. are, to one extent or another, like this, as far as I can tell.
And again, as an education policy wonk, I think, okay, how do we change this? How do we get the history teachers out there across America to listen to your perspective and others and to think about teaching the story of America this way? There's an impulse in ed reform to say, well, we'll make them do it.
Right.
We'll make sure the history standards are lined up this way. And we'll have some kind of regime where they'll get in trouble if they don't teach it this way, or we'll have a history test. And the only way that the kids do well is if it's taught this way. But it feels like what's more needed is some kind of persuasion, right?
Yeah.
Somehow try to persuade the teachers and the system that they work in that just teaching the Howard Zinn style history is bad for America.
Right, and that's one of the things I actually appreciate about the Trump moment is that there are lots of places where I could be scoring points in the sort of your tears are delicious, you're hypocrites for saying this, that, or the other thing. I'd rather have buy-in. And I think there are a lot of decent, serious-minded, progressive types who are like, something's gone awry here. And some of them are losing their minds and over-exaggerating the problem. Trump isn't Hitler. Hitler could have repealed Obamacare. But I think there is this Yasha Monk is one of these guys who recognizes that, and Sherry Berman wrote a wonderful piece about this in The Guardian of all places a couple months ago, that when you start talking about white people as a monolith and B, as inherently, for want of a more nuanced word, evil or bad, you don't get white people to agree with you. What you end up getting is them getting defensive and saying, hey, wait a second, I never had slaves, or my grandfather, fought in World War II, or, I'm from Vermont where my great-great-grandfather fought for the Union Army. Why am I, being beaten up like this? And you get people to be defensive, and then you start getting people to start develop a white identity, which is historically fairly anomalous in America. I mean, there used to be a WASP identity, but Italians and East Europeans were not considered whites, and Jews certainly weren't. And none of that is good for America. And I think there are more and more people who are recognizing that. And so it's interesting, I didn't mention it, but I saw this on Twitter this morning. Apparently, Barack Obama was on C-SPAN recently, and he said, where is this thing? Oh, I thought I had it in there. He had this thing where he said, look, people need to realize when they talk about identity politics that the people who originated identity politics are the ones who said that blacks counted for 3/5 of white people. Jim Crow is identity politics. Now, he's wrong about the 3/5 clause in terms of the historical context, and it didn't originate there. Identity politics goes back 10,000 years. But it's actually very, very helpful to have Barack Obama pointing out that white supremacy is a form of identity politics, and that judging people, saying, identity politics is basically this idea that is as old as aristocracy, that says that simply by virtue of an accident of your birth, some people are better or more deserving than other people. And it's amazing how people can recognize the problem with that when they're on the outside of the group, but they don't recognize it within their own group. And the emphasis on these things like identity politics, telling like 5-year-old white kids that, they're beneficiaries of white supremacy, which they may be to some extent, but it's not a great mindset to have, of thinking that the second you walk into the room, if you see someone, once you know the color of their skin, you know all you need to know about them. That is not an American idea. Those are the kinds of ideas that America was founded to reject. And I think that persuasion on this is the only way to go.
All right, let's open it up to some questions. So we're going to grab the microphone.
It's me again, Shaketiri Size. In 2000, Bob Kagan wrote of Colin Powell that he thinks that to go to war, the whole public should support the war. The problem is that he doesn't think the public will ever support a war. And the problem with a lot of conservatives today is that they think that we should not spend money. The problem is that they think everything government spends is a waste. Mm-hmm. And you were recently at Arizona State, my alma mater, at School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. It's a great school. It's the board of it are a lot of Hoover people, and it's a civic education school. So I was wondering 2 questions. One, is that actually a worthy public spending? And 2, states that are not willing to do that, should the federal government get involved or not?
All right. So for those of you who don't know, the school is talking about the Arizona State Legislature, which I did not know really much of any of this stuff until I got out there. The Arizona State Legislature just basically said, screw this. We're not teaching our kids really important stuff like civics, classics, the canon, free market economics. So they created these schools at Arizona State and University of Arizona that do it. And when I was first getting briefed on this, I was like, oh, this sounds kind of sketchy. But the academics there are all top flight as far as I could tell. It's a weird mix of Straussians and Hayekians, so you never know what you're going to get. But the problem with it they have on a funding basis is that it's basically a line item in the state budget, and it could go away tomorrow with the political tides. So I was telling them you really need an endowment. So I think it's great. I was really, really impressed with it, and it was one of those. I'm constantly being asked for like uplifting, positive stories because I wrote this book that might as well be take a bath with a toaster, right? And that was really a positive thing. I was really impressed by all of that, and it seemed to have pretty good support from the school. I don't love the idea of the federal government doing it. I think that there's first of all, a real danger of O'Sullivan's Law kicking in. O'Sullivan's Law, for those who don't know, is my colleague at National Review, John O'Sullivan, said any institution that is not explicitly conservative becomes liberal over time. Mm-hmm. And part of it is because of this Schumpeterian stuff, right, is that the people who are interested in doing foundation work go into foundation work, and they tend to be from, one world. And but I would be interested, if you could come up with some sort of National Endowment for Humanities kind of block grant kind of thing to do more of that stuff, I'd be interested in it. But I'm so in the mode of pushing power down to the most local level possible. The idea of a new federal program for anything kind of makes me want to flip the safety on my rifle.
My name is Scott Spages. Thanks for being here. Growing up, I had a real interest in social studies, and the people around me who loved me said, don't waste your time, there's no money in that. So, of course, I went to college, studied architecture, and eventually got a degree in business because I had no proclivity in architecture. So do you think that's an important component in this moving forward to help people to see a career path in these types of subjects to revive this?
I do. There's a chicken or the egg problem with, like, let's just double teachers' salaries. That kind of thing keeps the existing teachers in there. I'm a very, and I want to be very clear. I've been around the country talking about a lot of this kind of stuff, and I meet some really wonderful including public school teachers all around the country who are interested in civics. This is not a completely broad brush thing. There are myriad exceptions to the rule, but we're talking about at the level of generalization. I think it's a problem. I think, you know, part of the problem, part of it is a symptom of the sort of romantic era we're in of individualism and this idea of sort of sacrificing of yourself for the greater good actually ironically appeals more to people in search of a sort of a religious mindset. You know, there's a certain extent to which contemporary progressivism and liberalism is essentially a secular religion, and it attracts people who are decent, good people who are looking to satisfy that itch. And the more traditionally religious, particularly of all, the sort of Protestant, you know, work ethic type, they have opportunities to do good in their own community through their churches and local civic institutions. And so they want to build up a business, they want to build up a career and all of the rest, and they want to provide for their families. It's a different psychological outlook. I don't know how you fix that per se. I do think, though, that in my dream of dreams, I would like to invert the tax pyramid in this country. I would like most of your tax dollars to stay close to home, and then the stuff that goes to Washington is only for the stuff that's actually like in the Constitution, you know, military, mentions the post office, you know, but that's about it, right? And again, that's not actually doable, but I think that's a way to think about it. And if you did that, the opportunities for recognition and status in local communities would be more available and they would matter more. Instead, we have this big sorting where if you really want to make a mark in life, you feel like you have to leave your various communities and go to a handful of cities, sort of like Amazon. And I think that is a driver of a lot of our problems.
But there's something here, though, about how we talk about our teachers. And I don't remember anybody back in the Obama days, certainly not with Betsy DeVos or other people with kind of a platform, talking about teachers as potentially a big part of the solution to the partisanship and to what's bringing this country apart, that they can help bring us together, you know, teaching our children how to have respect for people who have different views, but also teaching them. I think that would be very compelling if we found a way to value teachers. I mean, of course, we got to worry about the nuts and bolts of it as well, but that would resonate with a lot of people. And I think you're right that there are a lot of teachers out there do go into it, you know, not just they like kids, they want to work with kids, but also this notion that you are our nation builders, you know, and you have an important role, and we value you for that. Could be powerful. Raj?
Thanks, Mike. Raj Vinakota. I'm just wondering, Jonah, how do you, with localism, address not over-accentuating the pluribus over the unum, especially with the significant geographic sorting that's happening in our country?
Yeah, stipulate there will be new challenges. You know, as a conservative, I don't believe in silver bullets to anything. I think they're only trade-offs. And so my approach would obviously have problems. You know, Ryan Salam, my colleague at National Review, actually has almost not quite the opposite view I have, but his view is that you want state governments to be really lean, and then the federal government's the only institution that can account for these disparities where, you know, 2% of education spending in West Virginia is just not going to be anything like what 2% of education spending in California is. And I get those kinds of things, but I'm much more interested in part because I'm much more comfortable talking about ideas and stories and arguments than I am about the nitty-gritty of the public policy point. But I will say that what I think is one of the major problems that we have in this country is that the way we talk about diversity is very much a part of this identity politics thing where we want people to look different but think all the same way. And I think we could use a lot more conversation about variety. And when I talk to college kids about this, they get it, right? I mean, they've been taught that you can't say states' rights because they immediately think that means I want to bring back slavery, because that's what they've been taught. But if you talk about variety, if you talk about making this a more interesting country to drive across, if you talk about how Austin has a point when they say keep Austin weird, or that Oregon shouldn't have to look to a bureaucrat in Washington to be allowed to import stinky cheese or have higher alcohol content beer. They get that. They don't like the homogenization of America. And I think that giving people more power locally, it may create economic, imbalances and distortions, but you also you create more institutions, more ecosystems where people can go to find the lifestyle that suits them.
But the point is, we still, there's a problem though if, in Portland they teach one version of history, right?
Yeah.
And in rural West Virginia they teach another. I mean, this is where we're like, how do we bring some commonality to telling this story, this American story?
Yeah, no, I get that. But, my hunch is, and Yuval would probably know this better than I would, but my hunch is that in the 19th century, the history they taught you in Texas and the history they taught you in New York State and Vermont had some significant disparities already. And I don't think there's any problem with that. The Founding Fathers used to say, in essentials, unity, in everything else, liberty. And I think if we did a better job of the civilizational aspect, of what I can't remember what you call it, but the emotional learning stuff, if we did a better job of civilizing the barbarians, you can fill in the patriotism later. I think that a little more civic, or if you want to call it nationalistic pride based on a state or local community level would actually be a very healthy thing for giving people a better sense that they first and foremost live in a place that has meaning to them.
Well, every state requires some kind of state history, so you got that. All right, Christina.
So, Christina Culver, and I spent a lot of time thinking about how to grow and scale great schooling. And I'm also on the board of Washington Latin here in DC, which has a classical education. And as part of that, I've been kind of mystified at how all of a sudden this is something special that we're teaching versus something that's real. And I guess one of my questions is, and I've been having conversations with the founder of Great Hearts and Basis and these schools that are trying to grow these programs of classical education and great books, is whether or not civics education has kind of lost its brand, and whether or not there's another way to talk about it, because we can't find teachers to even teach in our schools that have a familiarity with how to teach Socratic method, let alone the content.
Yeah.
And then you have, so we have this pipeline issue. We have parents who don't know what it is, and but once they get a taste of it, they want more of it.
Yeah.
So sort of the big conversation we're having is, how do we build its brand?
Yeah.
And quite frankly, I would argue that you're really good at it. I just think you need larger audiences.
I don't have a ready-made off-the-shelf answer for that. I will tell you, though, I think there's a real hunger. Again, we're talking about elite family. I don't, not necessarily the 1%, but we're talking about upscale, affluent families, the kind of families that Charles Murray criticizes for refusing to preach what they practice, of staying intact, of raising and educating their kids well, but they won't tell other people that bourgeois values be good for them too, right? I was amazed. So my daughter's 15 now. When we looked for private schools in D.C., every single school we went to one extent or another, they all emphasized diversity, but all but one that we looked at emphasized diversity as their comparative advantage, by which I mean they said those other schools may talk about how much they care about diversity, but we really care about diversity, right? I care about diversity. It's on my list, like with good gym and, do they teach civics? It's there. I'm not against it. But this idea that I would pick this school solely based on this, it's like going to a car lot and saying, I want a red car. And we actually, at Georgetown Day, the headmaster there explicitly told us, go read the mission statements of these other schools. And you will find a lot of code words like academic rigor and scholarship. And he said, we want to be very clear with you that we consider our social justice mission more important than our academic mission. And my wife and I were stuck in the middle of this big crowd at an open house, and we were like, how do we get out of here, or should we just start cutting ourselves, right? I mean, there are a lot of parents out there who have a hunger. They don't want to take their kids to a white supremacist school. They want their kids to have a normal, well-rounded education where this stuff isn't necessarily the focus of everything. And I think that the market is waiting for you out there. It's certainly out there. I mean, I have lots of friends who send their kids homeschool, send their kids to parochial and charter schools, hungry for this kind of product. And but I don't. How you sell it? You should talk to Tim Carney. He went to St. John's, and he can still take out a cocktail napkin and explain the Pythagorean theorem on it.
Well, unfortunately, we are at time. Please join me in thanking Jonah for those great comments.